Even as early as the 1930s, scholars and policymakers had come to the conclusion that the Versailles Treaty in 1919 that ended World War I was one of the causes of World War II because of the reparations imposed on Germany and inadequate attention to the international monetary system of the time. Well, at the beginning of World War I, this now goes back to 1914, countries suspended exports of gold, suspended convertibility of gold. They wanted to hang on to all the gold they could. They knew that gold would be crucial. Gold was money, in effect, and would be crucial in fighting and winning the war, so they weren't going to let any out of their hands. So the gold standard that had prevailed through almost all the 19th century, really back to the kind of the post-Napoleonic period in 1815, was abruptly ended with the outbreak of World War I. Interestingly, one of the biggest advocates for not ending it, at least in the UK, was an advisor to the Exchequer named John Maynard Keynes. You know, Keynes is his reputation as this gold basher, gold hater, you know, barbarous relic and all that stuff, which he never said, by the way. I actually tracked down the 1924 first edition of his works to see what he actually did say, and he was not talking about gold. He was talking about the gold exchange standard of the 1920s, which I would agree with Keynes was a very flawed system. But he argued strenuously in 1914 that the UK should not go off the gold standard, and the reason he said that was, we're not going to win the war with money or with gold. We're going to win the war with credit. You're going to have to borrow a lot of money to do this, and if you suspend gold, you're going to destroy your credit. But if you maintain the gold standard, you'll maintain your credit and be able to borrow far more and fight the war. And that's exactly what happened. Jack Morgan, based in New York, raised enormous amounts of money for France and the UK, and raised no money for Germany, and that was one of the decisive factors. So now kind of move ahead to the 1920s. One by one, countries had to rejoin the gold standard. Gold standard was voluntary. There was no IMF, International Monetary Fund, at the time, but that left them with a big decision, which is, what is the new exchange rate? There had been a pre-World War I, pre-1914 exchange rate. Each currency was pegged to gold at whatever that government chose. They would obviously try to do something that made commercial and economic sense. But you joined voluntarily and you picked your own exchange standards, so to speak. Of course, once you pegged to gold, you pegged every other currency in the world, because not everywhere, but all the major trading currencies, because they're pegged to gold also. And France and Belgium and Italy and a number of countries went back at a greatly devalued rate. It was they devalued the currency and raised the price of gold denominated in their currencies. And they did that. It was a simple recognition of the fact that whatever the pre-war gold standard was, they had printed enormous amounts of money to fight the war. If you're going to go back to gold, you either had to devalue the currency to reflect the increased money supply, or you could decrease the money supply, but that would cause a recession. They basically inflated their currencies and went back to gold at a new standard. One exception to that was the UK. And at this point, we're talking 1925, Winston Churchill, believe it or not, was Chancellor of the Exchequer. It was long before he was Prime Minister, but he was the head of the Treasury, in effect. And he felt duty-bound and honor-bound to go back to gold at the pre-war exchange rate. He said that, a deal's a deal, a contract's a contract, people had faith in the paper money, let's maintain convertibility at the old level. Well, he did that, but as I suggested, you had to cut the money supply in half to maintain the new peg. That put the UK in a depression 3 years ahead of the rest of the world. We typically date our depression in the US from 1929, lasted all the way to 1940. But the UK was well in depression as early as 1926. Finally, 1931, they had a banking panic. They did devalue at that time. 1933, FDR devalued the US dollar against gold. There were all these dominoes that were falling. Of course, bank failures, bank panics, reduced world trade, agricultural output, and the Great Depression. And this was considered not only bad in and of itself, but a contributing factor to World War II. Created so much imbalance and so much irredentism and Germany's desire to take back lands that it had given up to France and Poland elsewhere, that it contributed to World War II. So here we were in 1944, before the war was over, but already Roosevelt, FDR, and and Churchill were looking past the war and said, look, we can't let this happen again. We can't win the war. They thought they would win the war by 1944. But we can't win the war and then not have a good international monetary system. We'll repeat all the blunders and errors of the 1920s and be back where we started. So they convened the Bretton Woods Conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, at the Mount Washington Hotel for that purpose of designing the system. Now, there were about 45 or so nations present. Believe it or not, the Soviet Union, which was an ally, of course, of the U.S. during World War II, was present. They ended up not signing the agreement, but they were there. An interesting footnote, but an important one. The lead U.S. delegate was the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. His name was Harry Dexter White. Harry Dexter White led the U.S. delegation. The U.K. delegation was led by John Maynard Keynes. And by the way, there were just, again, another footnote. The reason it was in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, at the Mount Washington Hotel. The UK and the US were really the only important voices. And then the UK was really speaking for the entire Commonwealth. That's what gave them, and they had a fair amount of gold that gave them a voice. But this was really all about the US hammering things out, compromising with the UK, and then coming up with something. And everyone else just kind of jumped on board. I'm sure there was give and take. It was pretty much hammered out by the US and the UK. But in all fairness, it was really dictated by the US. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because Harry Dexter White was a Stalinist agent. It might have been suspected at the time, but it was not really proven until the 1990s, after the Soviet Union fell, and he was working on Soviet orders. And his orders were to come up with a system that would destroy the British Empire. And he did, because the Bretton Woods system actually did destroy the British Empire. And the reason was that a lot of people think that all countries link their currencies to gold. That was the global gold standard. That is not what Bretton Woods did. Bretton Woods pegged all currencies to the US dollar. And then the US dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. Now, by extension, or transitive law, if you want to use some sixth grade math, you were kind of pegged to gold because you were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. But technically, you were pegged to the dollar. That made the dollar the kind of global hegemonic currency, if you will, but also left the UK extremely vulnerable because they had issued a lot of sterling. They were technically redeemable into gold, but there's no way that the UK had that much gold. It wasn't even close. But by diminishing the role of sterling and elevating the role of the dollar, it made sterling more vulnerable to runs on the bank, basically, which then fed into the whole independence movement in the 1950s. It wasn't the sole cause, but when India, I believe, went independent in 1947, and then throughout the 50s, the African countries, Singapore, one by one, they left UK. So it actually worked. By undermining the dominant role of sterling and highlighting sterling's vulnerability to a run on gold, it exacerbated economic tensions with everybody, including Canada, Australia, and a lot of the African members of the Commonwealth. And it did lead to the breakup with the British Empire. So it's kind of mission accomplished for Morgenthau. But coming out of it, you did have a world where the only currency pegged to gold was the dollar, and everybody else was pegged to the dollar. Now, why did they do it that way? Valuing against gold was a total crack up. It usually came hand in glove with the banking panic, as it did in the UK in 1931. So they felt that if you could modulate that process, the dollar was always pegged to gold. That was the anchor of the whole system. But if you ran into trade deficit problems, there was a swing lender. The swing lender was the International Monetary Fund.